Dr. Damien Short to share with us some insights from his recent book on redefining genocide.
That's the book. I'm going to try and talk you through how I came to write it, what my original interests were, how they developed, and how I moved into this field of ecocide studies, and in particular looking at what we call the process of extreme energy and how it has potentially genocidal implications, but also how it has a lot to say for the rest of us too. So, without further ado, I should also thank the co-authors for several of the chapters of the book, one of whom is here tonight, Haifa Rashid, Jen Hughesman and Vinay Prakash, who co-authored 3 chapters with me as well. Okay, I'll briefly want to go through how I came to the genocide word and the concept through my work in Australia, then look at the notion that it's Lemkin's concept, and then what we call the cultural method of genocide. One of the things that interested me in particular was the idea that it's a method and not a different form. Okay, it's often looked at as a different form of genocide, and actually I'd argue that it's a method of genocide. And then I look at how I've extended that into the environmental realm and the environmental method of genocide. And then I'll look at extreme energy, where that takes us, and then briefly mention the notion of ecocide alongside that. Now, this was the starting point for me. The reaction in Australia to the Stolen Generations report about child removal policies and its conclusion that the child removal policies in Australia were genocide. And the reaction was this. No one in his right senses believes that the Commonwealth of Australia will be called before the bar of public opinion if there is such a thing and asked to answer for any of the things which are enumerated in the Convention, i.e. the Genocide Convention. The horrible crime of genocide is unthinkable in Australia. That we detest all forms of genocide arises from the fact that we are a moral people. So these statements were read out and seen in the press umpteen times after the report on the Stolen Generations. And then the more exaggerated versions, indicative here. Indigenous peoples in their more extreme moments have a weakness for dramatising their suffering by invoking the idea of genocide, which we know described as a prefabricated emotional charge. Similarly, Ron Brunton argued that genocide, the rhetorical misuse by political activists and others indifferent to the importance of proper hierarchies of wrongdoing, attracted to genocide status as the ultimate evil. So I was looking at these, and I was looking at the interview data that I had in Australia, which contradicted that. And in essence, I became interested in what was behind the convention. We've seen the text of the convention. I became interested in Lemkin's original definition of genocide and what he had in mind when he lobbied for the convention. And for Lemkin, it was very, very important that we understand genocide as having that cultural method potential. And the culture, in a sense, animates the genos in genocide. And there's a number of scholars that have looked at Lemkin's unpublished work and gone through the archives. And now we've got a resurrection of this appreciation of culture as an important aspect of understanding genocide. Cultural genocide, Lemkin said, is the most important part of the convention. But it was ultimately removed from the convention, and he subsequently wrote, I defended it successfully through 2 drafts. It meant the destruction of the cultural pattern of a group, such as the language, the traditions, the monuments, archives, libraries, churches, in brief, the shrines of the soul of a nation. But there was not enough support for this idea in the committee, so with a heavy heart, I decided not to press for it. He had to drop an idea which, in his words, was very dear to me. The result then is in popular consciousness and in much scholarly work, there's been an emphasis on ethnically motivated mass killing as a way to understand genocide. So I was intrigued, as Dirk points out, that this in a sense is seeking to instruct Lemkin somewhat differently. So he argues that the extraordinary implication with those who seek to redefine genocide as mass killing is that Lemkin didn't properly understand genocide, despite the fact that he invented the term and went to great trouble to explain its meaning. Instead, most scholars presume to instruct Lemkin retrospectively about his concept, although they are in fact proposing a different concept, usually mass murder. And then I came to Larissa Beren's point, and I think this is a very important one for this discussion today. And she argues the use of the term genocide to describe the indigenous colonial experience has been met with scepticism from some quarters. She was talking about this in the midst of the history wars in Australia. Yet the political posturing and semantic debate do nothing to dispel the feeling that indigenous peoples have that this is the word that adequately describes their experience as colonised peoples. So that's how I came to start developing this interest in genocide through the lens of genocide in Australia. And in all of the interviews I did in Australia, what was coming up time and time again was environmental degradation, okay? Dispossession, environmental degradation, and how that had a genocidal effect, a genocidal impact on indigenous peoples. So I started to look at all of these areas of environmental destruction in Australia: mining, deforestation, forest degradation, agriculture, clearing, overgrazing, fertilizer use, pesticide use, etc., etc. And then I became interested in where energy fits into this, and the energy supply for all of us, and capitalism as a potential driver of genocide. And this is where we're all implicated in the sense. So this is where I ultimately ended up working quite a bit on in the last few years. And you end up reading an awful lot of scientific material, an awful lot of things like World Bank reports, energy outlooks and things like that. And you start to understand how the global system and its dependence on energy can in fact be a driver of genocide in a contemporary sense, if you understand genocide in a Lemkinian fashion in the world today. So one of the things that really struck me, looking at these energy reports, is that we currently have a decline of all of our major resources, oil and gas in particular, of about 9% per year. We all know in a global capitalist-driven economy we need to be aiming for around 3% growth. And yet we're dependent on these resources. So there's a distinction now between those resources that are easy to get at, what we call conventional stuff, the stuff that flows out easily, and what we're now moving into an era of unconventional energy resources, which are much less efficient, much more difficult to get at. Hence the idea of extreme energy. So, myself and a number of colleagues have defined extreme energy as a process whereby energy extraction methods grow more intense over time, as the easier to extract resources are depleted, and the process is then driven by unsustainable energy consumption. But it's important because extraction effort strongly correlates with damage to society and the environment. You can see this here. The more energy that goes into it, the less society ends up using. What we call the energy return on energy invested is much, much lower for unconventionals. An example, something like we'll see in a minute, Canada's tar sands. Conventional oil would produce 1 barrel of energy in, between 60 and 100 barrels of energy out. The tar sands between 1 to 3 and 1 to 6. Drastically less efficient. It also does that. Okay, you had boreal forest on the one hand, and then what's been described as Canada's Mordor on the other side. You can sort of get a sense of the scale of the beast. Can be seen from space, apparently. They have a very, very large surface area footprint. Wonderful industry euphemisms here. Tailing ponds, it's just a pond, it's not a lake. Tar pits, these trucks, absolutely enormous. Some of them require elevators for the drivers to get into the main cab. Absolutely enormous things. So, myself and Jen Hughesman, former MA student here, started looking at the tar sands, primarily because Indigenous people were using the language of genocide to describe their contemporary experience under this energy extraction process. Key quote here: if we don't have land, or we don't have any way to carry out our traditional lifestyles, we lose who we are as a people. So if there's no land, then it's the equivalent in our estimation as the genocide of a people. And there are plenty more quotations of a similar nature, much the same also now in Australia. Not the tar sands, this is an average coal mine in Australia. Okay? The surface level coal mines, they have massive scarring on the landscape. You know, it doesn't look dissimilar actually. We've also got a very, very difficult clean-up operation, or possibly nigh on impossible. These things don't tend to be easily rectified. Very recent article in The Guardian talking about what happens afterwards and the effect it has on Indigenous communities. It's also not well known, but you know, coal is actually a pretty radioactive process. I was quite surprised when I came across this. George Mumby has written about it a lot in the UK, arguing actually it's so radioactive, it's more dangerous than nuclear. Other people disagree, but nonetheless it's highlighting the fact that it's by no means a clean process. And now you've got the new edge of this extreme energy process in Australia, coal seam gas, or what we call in the UK coal bed methane, which we're also potentially going to have in the UK. What worries a lot of Indigenous people is when you cluster these things together, it takes up a lot of land. So that picture on the left there is what happens when these pads are clustered together. It covers a lot of area. And then you get things like this. This is methane escaping into the river. So the river is literally full of methane in a lot of places, which obviously makes it much less habitable. So the environmental destruction that comes with this is quite considerable. This is in the US, so it's, you know, it's a global phenomenon now because the need is a global one. And literally nowhere is safe. These things are coming closer and closer and closer to human populations. So these are some pictures from the US, and without adequate regulation, this is the sort of stuff that you're going to get more and more of. So that's a waste pit. You get the trade-offs. Often companies are promising to do things like, you know, improve playground facilities and things. If schools will have frac pads, for example, in their grounds. So literally nothing is off limits. The effect on farming is producing interesting alliances between farmers and Indigenous communities in Australia. These are, you know, there's literally tons of empirical, peer-reviewed scientific evidence out there that isn't really being discussed adequately, in my view. And then you also get this, the industrialisation of the landscape. Around 4,000 trucks are required per frac pad, for example. Is a huge, huge altering of the landscape. And we're now likely to see that in the UK, quite possibly. So the connection of all these things together was the major project of the book then. And I finally came across some material which did this from the 1970s, which connected genocide and ecocide, another way of describing this large-scale environmental destruction. And it was the potential idea of revising the Genocide Convention when it wasn't being used by the Subcommission on the Prevention and Protection of Minorities. And what they argued was that possibly the Genocide Convention wasn't adequately used because the cultural method had been taken out. And they looked to possibly replace it, bring it back in, alongside an idea of ecocide as related to genocide. So from that moment I started looking at the history of ecocide as well and how all these things are connected and the role of energy in particular. And we found that it was 1970 and 1973 when ecocide could be really seen in the UN system. And Richard Thorpe was the person who first came up with a draft ecocide convention and said, man has consciously and unconsciously inflicted irreparable damage to the environment in times of war and peace. But unfortunately there wasn't much appetite for revising the Genocide Convention ultimately, and the idea was dropped. But even then it would have still been limited to the establishment of a genos. It wouldn't have applied more generally. And since then we've had Polly Higgins in particular and the Eradicating Ecocide campaign that looked to make it what they call the missing fifth crime against peace, to have it on a par with genocide and war crimes. So we've only got a few minutes left. So I'll just highlight what it means for everyone else. We talked about indigenous peoples, but in general, there's a consensus now amongst climate scientists that this extreme energy idea and endeavour is tantamount to sprinting in the wrong direction. And that was a quote from Kevin Anderson. One of the major problems is you get this sort of picture everywhere. This is the UK, it's out of date now, but the most recent up-to-date one, too hard to fit on. This is a major element of the problem. Perhaps in another context it might be called what it is, arguably corruption. You've got here Lord Brown, lead non-executive director, straight into the Cabinet Office, whilst simultaneously being the chairman of the UK's main fracking company, Cordrilla. Right? And this picture arguably is much the same in Australia. I should imagine it's much the same in the US too. A major, major problem. And then back to the rest of us. If you look at capitalism and the key as a potential driver of things like genocide, this is where we come into, in particular, what Annie Leonard calls stuff, things. This is a large part of what we all contribute to it. So it was a long journey, lots of elements involved. I tried to bring it all together in the book. A bit more time than I had here. But okay, I shall finish on that note.